Hello, I will present our research paper, Cosmovision of Data, an indigenous approach to technologies for self-determination. I'd like to start with our statements of positionality and reciprocity, mentioning that the partners from Tosepan, the indigenous organization we're currently collaborating with, invited me to visit and learn about their technological projects and their organization. All the research plans were agreed through several meetings with methods and activities respectful of the Masewal values, and we as a research team will keep on contributing with organization projects in the future. The first and third authors of this paper were born and raised in Latin America. We are from Mexico and Brazil respectively, while the second author was born and raised in Europe. We're all deeply aware of the current forms of colonialism, and we recognize the historical debt with indigenous peoples as the original guardians of their land and of global natural resources, and acknowledge the right for self-determination. In this presentation, I will describe how we analyze practices of data and technology projects carried out by the Masewal Indigenous group through their union of cooperatives, Tosepan, which I will introduce later on. We present fieldwork with the Masewal people and their approaches to technologies, including appropriation for self-determination, since they're currently creating tools for people to contribute, adapt, repurpose, and empower their community identity. Our work builds on the colonial HCI, pluriversal design and technologies, and the expansion of indigenous representation in HCI, particularly from the concept of Cosmovision. From the context of indigenous peoples in Latin America, it can be understood as a structured vision in which members of a community coherently combine their notions about the environment in which they live and about the cosmos in which they situate human life. It provides individual and collective meaning to living, conceiving, and thinking about the physical and the spiritual world, and it also conducts the balanced relationships between humans, the universe, and nature. We discuss how the Masewal vision of technology is not an abstraction of the world, but a connection and augmentation of their immediate territory and their practices. Thus, data and systems are interrelated with and embedded in the material context instead of being disconnected, non-representational entities. We draw considerations for the HCI community to embrace approaches to data and information systems from the concept of Cosmovision of Data, a framework about how technologies could be designed for individual practices and connections with nature, in what we call the microcosmos, while supporting communal actions for self-determination, the Meso-cosmos, and considering broader world-making processes, prosperity, and plural representation, the macrocosmos. To contextualize our research, it's fundamental to introduce Tosepan, which is a union of cooperatives founded by Masewal people from Cutural in Mexico almost 50 years ago, and it's modeled on their identity, their language, which is called Nahuatl, their worldview, and their socioeconomic practices against a marginalizing capitalist system, which is still threatening their identity and their way of living in their territory. A particular research relationship was established with the communications cooperative, Radio Tosepan Limaxtum, to learn about their technology projects, their radio station, their mobile network, and their plant database, Taiwaloni, which also will be introduced later in the presentation. This tool aims for people in the territory to contribute with their own data collected from individual and communal experiences, identities, and knowledges from a decentralized perspective. In order to understand and further explore these projects and topics, we carried out semi-structured interviews with 18 participants, where we covered notions around daily practices, cooperative economics, indigenous values, and perceptions around technologies. We also ran a speculative design workshop with 40 participants, where we explored concepts for ownership and translating particular indigenous values as part of speculative new technologies. Following a detailed analysis of the information, we present our findings, which we also shared back with the members from Tosepan. Throughout many interviews, different methods and practices for collecting information and recording data about agricultural activities were discussed. This way, we came to understand how logs and records become personal practices that support the community, how sowing and planting, as empirical practices, help to interpret information about the nature, and how the Masewal people also gather information or data from nature itself in these embodied and experiential knowledge practices. Finally, the Masewal life process becomes an inherited practices for communal knowledge and also to sustain the Masewal life, the indigenous values, and the identity that of course connects people with nature and with the territory. In terms of perception of technologies, participants referred to mainstream tech as making the community lose communication, particularly with the younger generations. Technology was described as dominating as an invasive And also colonialism was mentioned as an important factor, and now it has been transformed in using digital media for its benefit. Nevertheless, this has also led to new visions for technology and new processes for appropriation, as the community wants to create new ideations that can better represent their experiences and their knowledge. As one participant says, it's good for indigenous communities to adopt and work on our own technologies. We have control over the information and what we want to share. It gives us autonomy. Tosepan has already developed technological projects that seek autonomy and self-determination. Their radio station is fighting against extractivism projects and imposed ideas of progress, for example. This reappropriation has come to understand how the Masewal people can have their own contents and also gives them trust that they can develop new technologies, for example, their mobile service. Ultimately, they are trying to translate the Masewal visions for a communal life into the digital domain that can integrate their values. Their most recent project, Taiwaloni, as their envisioned database, will allow users to contribute and cooperate with their own information. Although it's still conceptual, it aims to replicate and strengthen the self-organization processes of the local cooperatives, therefore becoming a mediator for their activities, and ideally as an instrument for the empowerment of the people and the territory. Participants were interested in collecting or sharing information about nature-related practices and conservation, so they don't get lost, to self-organization practices, about the assemblies and the communal meetings they have for the defense of the territory so more people can be informed, and about the preservation of Masewal knowledges, like the ancestral traditions and learnings, and as one participant says, it also connects to our cosmovision as Masewal. Motivated by the possibilities of further exploring these topics collectively, the radio team was interested in facilitating a process for technological ownership and for creating conceptual approaches for Taiwaloni, and possible physical manifestations to set these collective objectives. So we created a workshop and ran it together. And one of the activities from the workshop asked participants to explore potential representations and interpretations for Taiwaloni as a novel or speculative technology or system. Participants reflected on how these actions could be represented or physically represented and serve as pillars for the creation of alternative and locally aware technologies more broadly. We present two prototypes here. This is the first one, and this one aims to broadcast the knowledge of the communities and the Tosepan cooperatives to different towns in the territory and beyond. This prototype was conceptualized as a large-scale installation that people can come and visit to explore different portals and learn about the Masewal identity and the organization, understanding that all the cooperatives are integrated by people and how their knowledges and their information and lived experiences can also contribute to this database. The second prototype allows users to explore and download data about different topics related to the Masewal knowledges and identity, understanding the importance of preserving and passing down the information for the communal achievement of their objectives. This team in particular was interested in creating different categories based on things or information they thought would be meaningful or important to interpret, again based on Masewal knowledges and on cooperative values, of course. And it works as a sort of projector. So data is stored in these different topics in physical devices, and then people can go and select which one they want to see depending on their interest on the topic they're interested in exploring further. This process allowed us to develop insights around the topics of legacy. As one of the participants says, one of our ideas is that people can download information from Taiwaloni, but they can't edit it. This way, they seem to be reflecting about how they want to preserve the original meanings and symbolisms of indigenous information, but also to document the historical processes that have made communities to keep on resisting. The participants also reflected on meanings of technology and how it has always been part of the communities and how they have different appropriation processes. They have even designed their own technologies according to their needs, even if they're not focused on the digital or electronic domains, for example. And finally, they also explored notions around the imaginations of these new technologies, how they could work or how they could translate particular values or ancestral practices or oral tradition, for example, into the creation of these new prototypes or objects. As one of the participants says, we go further. We skip the process of passing down information from generation to generation, and now we focus on a machine that can store it, Taiwaloni. And well, in connection to these ideations, the concept of Cosmovision was mentioned throughout the fieldwork to explain and make sense of these different interrelations between the Masewal and the territory, as it has been shown during the presentation. Tosepan life plans are connected to the way they understand the universe and the integration of the knowledges and ideas that consolidate their vision of the world, as it was expressed during the interviews and the workshop. This way, the participants' mentions of this concept of Cosmovision around the topics of technology informed the research approach and led the authors to analyze how certain entanglements between data, information, and the context exist, and how they can be interpreted as different but entangled lenses. As one of the participants mentions, the territory is not only the place where we walk and live, it's a relationship and interrelation that exists with everything. Our values are implicit there. All this led us to develop the framework of Cosmovision of data, aiming to provide reflections for HCI through 3 different lenses. The first one, which we call Microcosmos, sees data and its collection practices as organic, relational, and localized sourced for communal action, shared knowledge, and care for nature. This way, data becomes dynamic, shared owned, and adapted to different ways and different perspectives. This way, technology can also coexist with traditional personal practices, material, and embodied connections. Just as the Masewal return to sowing plants and natural environment as a source of information, they see these connections happening now with the digital world. Data then becomes a non-extractive and non-productive entity, but as a cooperative source to follow the same rituals and shared as a common good, just as they currently do as part of the cooperative values, but also as part of their Masewal knowledges and ancestral notions and understandings. The Meso-cosmos sees technology as an embodiment of the social system it inhabits and as a mediator for self-organization's ideals owned and led by the community. In this way, technology can support community-led practices for autonomy and for self-determination to challenge or fight colonialism and capitalism, particularly data and technology-related ones, but also as the COP emerge from efforts to resistance and challenge these extractive and colonialist processes and practices, their technologies are now echoing that same path and are becoming instruments to seek the prosperity of the land and its people. They seek a term for sovereignty, and they are creating a system that doesn't focus on economic wealth, but that it's more locally aware and highly relational. Finally, the macrocosmos focus on worldmaking, so how plural representations of Masewal and other indigenous peoples' worldviews, knowledges, ecologies, and practices can be applied to technologies for different epistemologies to exist. This way, technology can be seen or reflected upon to rethink the bigger picture, to engage in resistant actions, prosperity, and representation, and how it can connect with different indigenous efforts and concentrate diverse instrumental practices into the digital domain. Finally, being the guardians and keepers of the different ancestral knowledges and values that the Masewal and of course other indigenous peoples have practiced for centuries or have preserved for centuries, we see this as a culture flame new decolonized systems where data can be interwoven in these different spaces following the Zapatista ideal of a world where many worlds fit. This way, we see this cosmovision of data as 3 different levels deeply interwoven and interconnected. They integrate collaborations between the community and land that consolidate the Masewal identity, can contribute to the creation of more diverse and inclusive HCI, data systems, or technologies. And by including the cosmovision in the HCI discussion, we intend to mindfully interpret how technologies can connect to knowledges, territory, and practices as relational and embedded in the material context, in contrast to currently imposed tech developments, which can be more abstract or cannot be representational of the context or social system they are embedded in. Finally, we find it relevant to further the HCI discussion, connecting technology with these decolonized identities, land, and ecology. We would like to thank the Unión de Cooperativas Tosepan Titatanisque, particularly the Radio Tosepan Limaxtum team, for allowing us to be part of their technology projects. Also thanks to the Masewal, otherwise referred as Nahua people, and Tutunaco people from the Sierra Norte de Puebla for sharing their knowledge, experiences, and a spirit of resistance and autonomy. Thank you very much.